Grace Ashford never imagined that the sound of a closing door could carry so much meaning. But there she stood, in the chilly hallway of their Brooklyn apartment, listening to the metallic click that sealed yet another night alone as Christopher headed out to another event she was forbidden to attend. 5 years of marriage, and she had become a ghost in her own life, invisible to everyone except the housekeeper who brought her meals and the books she ordered online to fill the empty hours. On that particular December night, Grace didn't cry as she usually did in the early years. She simply walked to the panoramic window and watched Manhattan's lights twinkling in the distance, an entire city buzzing with possibilities from which she was exiled. Christopher had been clear from the start, though she had been too foolish to believe the cruelty of his words. "You lack refinement, Grace. My family, my business partners, they expect a certain standard. I need time to polish you." Polish her, as if she were a raw gem that needed to be shaped to shine in his private collection. The problem was, Christopher never really intended to display her. He merely wanted to keep her tucked away, safe and hidden, while he paraded around Manhattan with Isabella Whitmore draped on his arm. Isabella. The name burned in Grace's throat like poison. The elegant blonde socialite who appeared in society columns alongside Christopher at every art gallery opening, charity gala, and corporate event. "My image consultant," he'd explain on the rare occasions Grace dared to question him. "It's just business. You understand, don't you?" Grace understood perfectly. She understood she had married a man who was ashamed of her. She understood that her humble origins in Portland, her state university education, and her simple manners were indelible stains on her record in Christopher's eyes. She understood that he loved her only within the confines of their four walls, where no one else needed to know she existed. Her phone vibrated in her bathrobe pocket. An Instagram notification. Against her better judgment, Grace opened the app, and there it was, Christopher and Isabella at the opening of a new restaurant on the Upper East Side. He held her waist with an intimacy he never showed in public with Grace. The comments were effusive. "What a beautiful couple. When's the wedding? Your chemistry is undeniable." The chemistry was undeniable because it was real. Grace wasn't stupid. She knew Christopher didn't keep Isabella around just to impress his colleagues. There was something more there, something he'd never managed to feel for the wife he kept locked away like a dirty secret. But something shifted that December night. Perhaps it was the accumulation of 5 years of silent humiliation. Perhaps it was the image of Christopher smiling at Isabella with an adoration Grace had never received. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that she had spent so much time alone that she finally learned to talk to herself. And that conversation led her to an inevitable conclusion. She was worth more than this. Grace picked up her laptop, the one she used to pass the endless hours, and opened an email she had received 3 days ago. A proposal from Vision Tech Industries, the tech giant revolutionizing artificial intelligence and quantum computing. They had found the academic papers she published under a pseudonym, her analyses of market trends and technological innovation that had become required reading in specialized circles. They wanted to meet her. They wanted to offer her a position. For 3 days, Grace had ignored the email. Responding would mean defying Christopher. It would mean leaving the apartment. It would mean claiming an identity beyond hidden wife. But looking at his photo with Isabella, feeling the familiar weight of overwhelming loneliness, Grace finally typed a response. "Yes, I'm interested. When can we talk?" The reply came in minutes. Apparently, the corporate world didn't sleep. Even at 11 o'clock at night. Marcus Chen, Vision Tech's current CEO, who was about to retire, wanted to meet her in person. Tomorrow. At his office in Manhattan. Grace looked at her reflection in the window. A 32-year-old woman with disheveled brown hair and eyes that had forgotten how to shine. Christopher was right about one thing. She didn't seem to belong in his world. But perhaps the problem had never been Grace's lack of class. Perhaps the problem was that she belonged to a completely different world, one where value came from substance, not surface. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She spent hours reviewing her papers, preparing answers for potential questions, and slowly, methodically, planning a life that didn't involve waiting for Christopher to come home with the scent of another woman ingrained in his jacket. The next morning, she woke before sunrise. Christopher had arrived at 3 a.m. and was sleeping soundly in the guest room where he preferred to spend his few hours at home. Grace showered, put on the only suit she owned, bought years ago for a job interview that never happened, because Christopher had convinced her that working would be unnecessary and even embarrassing for a man in his position. The subway was crowded that morning, full of people rushing to their jobs, their lives, their ambitions. Grace felt strangely alive amidst the crowd, anonymous and free in a way she had never experienced in the isolation of the apartment. Manhattan didn't judge her. Manhattan didn't even know who she was. Vision Tech's offices occupied 15 floors of a midtown skyscraper. Grace introduced herself at the reception desk with trembling hands, certain that they would make a mistake, that they would send her away, that they would discover she was just a fraud hidden in a Brooklyn apartment. But Marcus Chen greeted her with a firm handshake and a genuine smile. For 3 hours, they talked about the future of technology, about ethics in artificial intelligence, about how to lead a company without losing humanity. Marcus didn't ask about her simple attire or where she came from. He cared only about what she thought, what she knew, what she could build. When the meeting ended, Marcus made an offer that left Grace breathless. Not just a job, the position of CEO. He was retiring and wanted someone with vision, with integrity, with the ability to transform Vision Tech into the next global powerhouse. He saw that in Grace, in the words she had written, in the ideas she had shared. Grace asked for 24 hours to think. She knew that accepting would mean detonating the life Christopher had carefully constructed. It would mean exposing her to the world. It would mean confronting everything he had said about her not being enough. But as she walked through the streets of Manhattan that cold December afternoon, Grace realized that the life Christopher had carefully constructed had never been hers to begin with. She called Marcus before she even got home. "I accept," she said simply, and heard the enthusiasm in his voice when he replied that they would make the public announcement in 3 weeks, right after New Year's. 3 weeks. Grace would have 3 weeks to prepare for the moment her existence would finally be revealed to the world Christopher had worked so hard to keep her from. The first thing Grace bought with Vision Tech's generous advance wasn't designer clothes or expensive jewelry. It was time. Time in the form of a small, shared office in an unassuming building in the financial district. A place where she could work without explanations, without questions, without Christopher unexpectedly showing up to control her every move. She started leaving the apartment every morning at 7, well before Christopher woke up. He never questioned it. Why would he? In 5 years, Grace had never challenged the established routine. Her morning absence was probably a relief, further proof that she had finally learned her place in his life. What Christopher didn't know was that Grace was building an empire in the hours he thought she was simply wandering aimlessly through the city. Marcus Chen became not only her mentor, but the first real ally she had had in years. He discreetly introduced her to Vision Tech's top executives, organized confidential meetings with investors, and most importantly, taught her how to navigate the corporate world with the same determination she applied to theory. "You have the knowledge," Marcus said during one of their prep sessions, But knowledge without presence is like having a Ferrari engine in a car without wheels. We need to work on your confidence. It was Marcus who suggested Diane Rothschild, an image consultant who worked exclusively with CEOs and political leaders, not to transform Grace into something she wasn't, but to help her present who she truly was, with authority and impact. The first meeting with Diane took place in a private studio in Soho. Grace arrived 40 minutes early, too nervous to wait at home. Diane was a black woman in her 50s, with grey hair cut in a bold style, and eyes that seemed to evaluate and understand simultaneously. "Marcus told me your story," Diane said bluntly, gesturing for Grace to sit. "Husband who hides you, public mistress, 5 years of forced invisibility. I must say, darling, when you finally show up at that New Year's Eve party, it's going to be better than the Times Square fireworks." Grace felt her face flush. "He told you about the party?" "He told me everything." Diane circled Grace slowly, assessing her with a professional eye. "Vision Tech is always a sponsor of the Metropolitan Club New Year's Eve Ball. It's Manhattan's most exclusive event. All the tech and finance magnates will be there. And this year, for the first time, Vision Tech's new CEO will make her public appearance." Grace's stomach clenched. The Metropolitan Club. She knew that name. Christopher had casually mentioned a few weeks ago that he would be spending New Year's Eve at an important corporate event. "Something you'd find boring," he had said with that condescending smile he often used. Grace had wondered then if Isabella would be there. Now she knew for sure she would. "I don't know if I can do this," Grace murmured, the courage she had felt in Marcus's office evaporating before the reality of what was to come. Diane stopped in front of her and held her face firmly, forcing her to make eye contact. "Darling, you've already done the hard part. You survived 5 years of being invisible. Now I just need to teach you how to be impossible to ignore." Over the next 3 weeks, Grace lived a double life so intense that sometimes she forgot which was real. During the day, she was the future CEO of Vision Tech, attending strategic meetings, reviewing financial projections, learning the names and stories of each of the company's 1,200 employees. Marcus was transferring not just a position, but a legacy, and he took it seriously. At night, after returning to the apartment, she was once again the Grace Christopher knew, silent, almost invisible, preparing dinner he rarely ate at home, pretending to watch television while he worked in his office or, more often, went out for yet another business engagement. The physical transformation was gradual but deliberate. Diane took her to a hairdresser in Greenwich Village who transformed her lifeless brown hair into something rich and lustrous, cut in layers that framed her face in a way Grace had never imagined possible. It wasn't dramatic enough for Christopher to notice on the rare occasions he actually looked at her, but it was refined enough to completely change how she saw herself in the mirror. "Beauty isn't about calling attention," Diane explained as they selected garments in a private showroom. "It's about silent command. When you walk into that room, people should feel your presence before they even see your face." The New Year's Eve dress was chosen with surgical precision. Not red, too obvious, not black, too common. It was a deep, almost celestial midnight blue, in Italian silk that caught and reflected light in ways that seemed supernatural. The cut was impeccable, elegant without being revealing, powerful without being aggressive. Diane had insisted on an emerging designer from Philadelphia instead of the obvious European houses. "Isabella Whitmore will be wearing Chanel or Dior," Diane explained. "Beautiful, but predictable. You'll be wearing something no one else in the room will have seen before. That makes a difference." Grace tried on the dress on a Saturday afternoon when Christopher was at a golf tournament. Looking at herself in the full-length mirror of the fitting room, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This Grace had posture, had presence, had something in her eyes that the hidden Grace had lost long ago. "That's you," Diane said softly behind her. "That's always been you. You were just buried under 5 years of being made to feel small." The media sessions were perhaps the most challenging part. Marcus brought in Rebecca Kim, a public relations expert who had managed crises for some of the country's largest corporations. Rebecca was blunt to the point of being brutal. "When the news breaks, and it will break, the media will find out about Christopher," Rebecca said during a prep session. "They'll find out about Isabella. They'll try to turn this into a reality show drama. We need to control the narrative before it controls you." Grace spent hours practicing answers to intrusive questions. How to maintain dignity when questioned about her marriage. How to redirect conversations back to Vision Tech's business. How to smile politely while reporters tried to elicit emotional statements from her. "You don't owe them your tears," Rebecca repeated constantly. "You don't owe them your pain. You only owe them professionalism and competence. The rest is yours." Christopher noticed the change about a week before Christmas. It was small, almost imperceptible. Grace was making coffee when he walked into the kitchen, already dressed for another day at the office. "You look different," he said, studying her with an intensity she hadn't seen in years. "Did you do something to your hair?" Grace felt her heart quicken, but kept her voice calm. "I trimmed it a bit. Do you like it?" He frowned slightly, as if trying to pinpoint exactly what bothered him. "It's different. I don't know if I like different." Of course not. Christopher never liked changes he hadn't personally orchestrated. But before he could continue, his phone rang. Isabella. Grace recognized the personalized ringtone he had set for her. "I need to take this," Christopher said, already walking out of the kitchen. "It's about the New Year's Eve party. Isabella is helping coordinate my part of the event, his part of the event, as if he were the host, the center of attention." Grace wondered what he would say when he discovered that this year the true star of the night would be Vision Tech's newly announced CEO. She wondered if he would recognize her immediately, or if the 5 years of invisibility had made her so faint in his mind that he wouldn't be able to connect the radiant woman on stage with the wife he kept hidden. The official announcement was scheduled for December 28th, 3 days before New Year's Eve. Marcus had insisted on the timing. Enough time for the news to circulate in corporate circles, but not so long that the novelty would cool before the party. Grace spent Christmas Eve alone, as always. Christopher had traveled to the Hamptons with his family, an annual event to which she remained perpetually uninvited. "They're not ready yet," he would always say, as if 5 years weren't enough time to prepare his aristocratic family to meet his middle-class wife. But that Christmas, for the first time, Grace didn't feel lonely. She sat in the small office she had rented, surrounded by Vision Tech documents, strategic plans, and financial projections. Diane had sent an expensive gift basket with artisanal chocolates and a simple note. "To the woman who is about to shake up Manhattan, Merry Christmas, CEO Ashford." CEO Ashford. Grace tested the title aloud. Alone in the silent office. It sounded strange, powerful, daunting. It sounded like a life she wasn't sure she deserved, but one she was determined to claim nonetheless. Her phone vibrated. A message from Marcus. "The press release is finalized. Final review tomorrow. Ready to change your life." Grace looked out the window at the Christmas lights decorating the surrounding buildings, the city that had been forbidden to her for so long. In 72 hours, everyone would know her name. In a week, she would be face to face with Christopher and Isabella, not as the hidden wife, but as the most powerful woman in that room. She typed her response with steady hands. "More than ready. It's time to stop being invisible." December 28th dawned grey over Manhattan, with heavy clouds promising snow that never quite arrived. Grace woke at 5 in the morning, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her own ears. In 6 hours, the entire world would know who she was. Christopher slept soundly in the guest room, completely oblivious to the storm about to break over his carefully constructed life. Grace watched him for a moment from the half-open door. This man who had promised to love and honor her, but who instead had chosen to hide her like an embarrassing mistake. She waited to feel something, anger or sadness, or even that desperate love she used to feel in the early years. But all she found was a curious emptiness, as if looking at a stranger who once meant something important. She dressed with deliberate care. Tailored black trousers Diane had helped her choose, a navy silk blouse, a structured blazer that added authority without seeming aggressive. Subtle but impeccable makeup, hair tied back in an elegant low bun. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not the hidden Grace, but the CEO who was about to make history. VisionTech's office buzzed with nervous energy when she arrived. Employees who had been confidentially informed about the leadership transition greeted her with respectful smiles and nods. Marcus waited for her in his office, which in a few hours would officially become hers. "Ready for this?" he asked, studying her with those keen eyes that had built a tech empire from scratch. Grace took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the moment. "I don't know if anyone is ever truly ready for something like this, but I'm willing to face it." Rebecca Kim entered like a whirlwind, tablet in hand, speaking rapidly. "We have 3 main media outlets confirmed for the press conference: Bloomberg, TechCrunch, and the Wall Street Journal. CNBC wants an exclusive interview right afterwards, and Grace—" She paused, making direct eye contact. "There are already speculations circulating on social media. Someone leaked something, not many details, but enough to create a buzz." Grace's stomach clenched. Christopher might have seen it. "Unlikely," Marcus interjected. "These are specialized tech circles. Your husband works in traditional financial consulting. Different worlds, even if adjacent." The press conference was scheduled for 11 o'clock in VisionTech's main auditorium. Grace spent the hour before reviewing her speech, testing the microphone, familiarizing herself with the space. Diane appeared for final adjustments, smoothing an invisible crease in Grace's blazer, applying an extra layer of lipstick. "Remember," Diane murmured as she worked, "you're not asking permission to be on that stage. You're not apologizing for who you are. You are simply stating a truth that already exists. You are the CEO of VisionTech. Act like it." At 10:50, Grace was backstage, listening to the murmur of the audience settling in. Rebecca did a final check. Marcus squeezed her hand with paternal encouragement, and then the lights came up, and it was time. Marcus walked onto the stage first, his presence commanding immediate silence. He spoke about his legacy at VisionTech, about the 2 decades he had dedicated to building not just a company, but a vision of how technology could serve humanity instead of replacing it. He spoke about the importance of leadership that balanced innovation with ethics, ambition with integrity. "And that's why," Marcus continued, his voice gaining intensity, "I've spent the last 6 months looking not just for a replacement, but someone who could take VisionTech beyond anything I ever imagined, someone whose vision for the future is as clear as it is revolutionary, someone who understands that technology without humanity is just empty code." Grace felt her legs tremble as she waited for her cue. "It is with immense pride that I present to you the new CEO of VisionTech Industries, Grace Ashford." "Ooh." The name echoed through the auditorium like silent thunder. Grace walked to the stage, each step measured and deliberate, exactly as Diane had taught her. The lights were intense, almost blinding, but she kept her gaze firm, focused. Camera flashes exploded in a constellation of white light. She positioned herself at the podium, allowing herself a moment to absorb the scene. Reporters with pens ready, cameras pointed, industry executives leaning forward in their seats, all waiting to see if she was equal to the moment. Grace began to speak, her voice clear and firm without hesitation. She presented her vision for VisionTech's future, spoke about the democratization of access to technology, about the potential of artificial intelligence when guided by robust ethical principles. She cited research, presented data, articulated strategies that left even the skeptics in the audience nodding in approval. Then came the questions. Professional ones at first, focused on business and corporate strategy. Grace answered them with growing confidence. Feeling increasingly comfortable in this role, she had secretly practiced for weeks. It was a reporter from Page 6, a gossip tabloid masquerading as journalism, who finally asked the question everyone was thinking, but hesitated to verbalize. "Ms. Ashford, your academic publications over the past 5 years have all been under a pseudonym. You have virtually no public presence. Can you tell us why you chose to remain so invisible?" The auditorium fell silent. Grace felt all eyes on her, felt the weight of the question that wasn't really about her academic career. It was about Christopher, about the 5 years hidden away, about being interesting enough to lead a billion-dollar company, but apparently not interesting enough to be seen in public with her own husband. Rebecca had prepared Grace for this. There were rehearsed answers, diplomatic redirections, ways to avoid the personal question altogether. But standing on that stage, with the lights of truth finally on her after so long in the shadows, Grace made a different decision. "I didn't choose to be invisible," she said calmly, each word measured and intentional. "Invisibility was imposed on me by personal circumstances that I won't detail here, because they are not relevant to my ability to lead this company. What is relevant is that I used those years not to lament my absence from the spotlight, but to become exceptional at what I do. I worked, I studied, I published research that changed conversations in my field. And now I am here, not despite the invisible years, but strengthened by them." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Visibility does not define competence. Presence at parties does not determine leadership ability. And if the last 5 years have taught me anything, it's that substance always, eventually, overcomes surface." The auditorium erupted in murmurs. Cameras clicked frantically. Grace saw Rebecca backstage, eyes wide but a slow smile forming, as if recognizing that Grace had just done something risky but brilliant. The press conference continued for another 40 minutes, but that moment had already set the tone. Grace Ashford would not be a CEO who apologized or explained. She would be a CEO who transformed apparent weaknesses into narratives of strength. When she finally stepped off the stage, Marcus intercepted her with a paternal hug. "You were magnetic," he said simply. "Absolutely magnetic." Rebecca was less sentimental but equally impressed. "Your phone's going to explode in 10, 9, 8. She counted, and exactly on 1, Grace's phone began to vibrate incessantly. There were messages from executives congratulating her, from media outlets requesting interviews, from universities wanting her to speak. And then, among all these professional notifications, a message appeared that made Grace's blood run cold. "Christopher, we need to talk. Now." He had seen it. Of course he had seen it. The news was already on all major business websites, being shared thousands of times on social media. Christopher Hartley's invisible wife had just been revealed as the new CEO of one of the country's most powerful tech companies. Grace stared at the message for a long moment. 5 years ago, that commanding tone would have sent waves of anxiety through her. She would have rushed home, prepared excuses, tried to mitigate her own existence so as not to offend his ego. But the woman standing in that hallway, still buzzing with the adrenaline of her triumphant presentation, was no longer that Grace. She typed a simple response. "I'll be home at 6. We can talk then." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact from a woman who had finally regained control over her own time, her own narrative, her own life. The following hours passed in a blur of interviews and meetings. Grace had lunch with Vision Tech's board of directors, answered questions live on CNBC, reviewed contracts with the legal department. Every interaction reinforced the same truth. She belonged there, not out of tolerance or charity, but by absolute merit. When she finally arrived home at exactly 6 o'clock, Christopher was waiting in the living room, his laptop open, displaying a Bloomberg article about her. His face was red, his jaw tense in a way Grace recognized as contained fury. "CEO," he said without preamble, his voice dangerously low. "You're the CEO of Vision Tech, and you didn't think it necessary to tell me." Grace carefully placed her handbag on the entrance console, taking her time to compose her reply. "I was going to tell you." "When? After all of Manhattan knew? After I looked like a complete fool to my colleagues?" And there it was, finally exposed. Not concern for her, not pride in her achievements, but only how it affected him, how it made him look. Grace felt something break definitively inside her, the last fragment of hope that Christopher might surprise her by being something other than who he had always been. "You look like an idiot," Grace said calmly, "because you spent 5 years hiding your wife while parading another woman on your arm. I merely made it impossible to keep pretending I don't exist." The silence that followed Grace's words was so thick she could feel it pressing against her skin. Christopher stood still, his face changing from red to white, his hands clenching the sides of the laptop so hard his knuckles turned white. Grace waited, holding her ground, refusing to retreat or soften the blow of her truth. "You don't understand," Christopher finally said, his voice trembling between anger and something Grace couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was fear. "Isabella is different. She belongs in that world. She knows how to behave, what to say, how to impress the right people. And I don't," Grace completed without emotion. It wasn't a question. It was simply the acknowledgement of a truth she had long ago accepted. "That's not what I meant to say." Christopher ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disarranging it in a way Grace rarely saw. He was losing his composure, that carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. "I thought I was protecting you. My family, my social circle, they're brutal to people who don't understand their unwritten rules. I was sparing you that cruelty." Grace felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat, but she held it back. "You were protecting me. Christopher, you locked me away in an apartment for 5 years. You made me believe I was so inadequate, so shameful, that I didn't deserve to be by your side in public. You paraded another woman as if she were your partner, while I existed only in the shadows. And you call that protection? I gave you everything." His voice rose, defensive and desperate. "This apartment, financial security, the freedom to do whatever you wanted during the day. You never had to work, never had to worry about money." "You gave me a gilded cage," Grace replied, her own voice remaining strangely calm. It was as if she were observing the conversation from outside her own body, finally seeing with absolute clarity what her marriage had always been. "And you convinced me I should be grateful for it. But Christopher, cages are cages, no matter how beautiful the bars." He took a step towards her, and Grace saw something new in his face, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "I love you," he said, and for a moment it almost sounded true. "Perhaps I went wrong in how I handled things, but I love you. You are my wife." "Your secret wife," Grace corrected. "Your shameful wife. The woman you only love when no one is looking." Christopher opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted by Grace's phone ringing. She looked at the screen and saw Rebecca Kim's name flashing. She hesitated only a second before answering, turning slightly away from Christopher. "Grace, you need to see this," Rebecca said without preamble, her voice laden with urgency. Someone leaked photos of Christopher and Isabella to page 6. Not just recent photos, but a 5-year compilation. They're making the connection. The story breaks in an hour. Grace's stomach tightened. What kind of photos? The kind that leaves no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Rebecca paused meaningfully. Grace, there are photos of them in very intimate situations. Entering hotels, kissing in alleys, thinking no one was watching. It's devastating for his narrative, but it could also become a media circus that drags you in. Grace closed her eyes briefly, processing. She had imagined that the truth about Christopher and Isabella would eventually come out, but not so fast, not so publicly. What do you suggest? I'm already working on a statement, something brief, dignified, that makes it clear you were aware of the situation but chose to focus on your career instead of marital drama. It positions you as the strong, resilient party. But we need your approval before releasing anything. Grace could feel Christopher behind her, no doubt catching enough fragments of the conversation to understand that something was happening. Send the statement to me. I'll review it and respond in 15 minutes. She hung up and turned to find Christopher with an expression of absolute panic. What was that? What's going on? Your relationship with Isabella is about to become public, Grace said simply, watching the blood drain from his face. 5 years of photos. You weren't as discreet as you thought. Christopher stumbled to the nearest sofa, sinking into it as if his legs could no longer support him. This will destroy me, my company, my reputation, my family. Grace watched the man who had been her husband, truly seeing him for the first time in years. Not as the imposing figure who had made her feel small, not as the guardian of a world to which she could never belong, but simply as a flawed man who had made terrible choices and was now facing the consequences. She waited to feel satisfaction, that sweet revenge she had imagined on lonely nights. But all she found was a weary sadness, an understanding that his destruction didn't undo the 5 years she had lost. You did this to yourself, Grace said finally, her voice gentle in a way that even surprised her. Every photo, every lie, every time you chose Isabella instead of honoring your vows, these were your choices, Christopher, not mine. He looked at her with eyes that seemed lost. What are you going to do? Grace picked up her phone again, opening Rebecca's email with the proposed statement. She read it carefully, considering every word. It was professional, compassionate without being weak, clear without being cruel. It positioned Grace exactly as she needed to be seen, a woman who had transformed personal betrayal into fuel for professional success. I'm going to release a statement acknowledging that our marriage had challenges, that you developed a relationship with someone else, and that I chose to focus on my own growth and career. I won't crucify you publicly, Christopher, but I also won't lie to protect your image. Is that all? His voice was laden with disbelief. After everything I've done, you're just going to move on? Grace considered the question, truly thinking about it. I could destroy you if I wanted to. I could leak my own details, paint you as the villain in every interview, use my new platform to make your life a public hell, and part of me wants that. I won't lie. She paused, meeting his eyes. But dragging you through the mud also drags me through it. It turns my story of triumph into a story of revenge, and I refuse to let you define my narrative any more than you already have. You had 5 years of controlling how I was seen. Now it's my turn to control my own story. Christopher had no answer to that. He simply sat there, a man confronted with the full cost of his choices, and for the first time since Grace had known him, he seemed genuinely small. His phone rang, the same personalized ringtone for Isabella. They both looked at the device on the coffee table, watching it vibrate insistently. Christopher made to pick it up, but then stopped, his hand suspended in the air as if he finally realized that answering that call in front of Grace would be the ultimate betrayal. "Answer it," Grace said, her voice surprisingly steady. "She's probably seen the news too. You'll need to coordinate your stories." Grace. "No." She raised her hand, cutting off whatever he was about to say. "There's nothing more to discuss tonight. I'll review Rebecca's statement and release it. You do what you need to do to control the damage on your end. And tomorrow, we need to start talking about divorce." The word hung in the air between them, final and inevitable. Christopher opened his mouth, closed it, and then simply nodded. It was the first honest thing he had done in their entire conversation. Grace picked up her laptop and retreated to the bedroom, the space that had been her solitary refuge for 5 years. She sat on the carefully made bed, the same spot where she had shed countless tears, where she had spent endless nights wondering what was wrong with her that made her unworthy of being loved publicly. Now, sitting there with the press statement on the screen before her, Grace finally understood the truth it had taken 5 years to learn. It had never been about her not being enough. It had always been about Christopher not being able to see her worth. She made small adjustments to the statement, softening some phrases, strengthening others. When she was satisfied, she pressed send and watched the words disappear into the digital ether, knowing that in minutes they would be everywhere, shaping how the world viewed her story. Her phone began to ring almost immediately. Media. Friends she hadn't seen in years, even her mother in Portland, who had read the news online. Grace ignored all calls except one, from Marcus. "How are you?" he asked, the genuine concern in his voice almost unraveling Grace's composure. "Honestly, I don't know. It's strange. I spent so long imagining what it would be like to confront Christopher with the truth, and now that it's happened, I feel a day empty, as if I had prepared for a war only to find the enemy had already surrendered before it even began." Marcus made a sound of understanding. "Retribution rarely brings the satisfaction we imagine. But Grace, what you did today, both at the press conference and in how you handled this situation, was extraordinary. You showed grace under pressure, literally. That's why I knew you were the right person to lead Vision Tech." "Grace under pressure," Grace repeated, a small laugh escaping her. "I guess my name finally fits." "It always did. You just needed time to grow into it." He paused. "The New Year's Eve party is still on. In fact, there's even more interest now. Everyone wants to see the CEO who transformed personal scandal into a public relations masterclass. Christopher will still be there, I presume. As will Isabella. The Metropolitan Club can't disinvite them without causing its own scandal." Grace had momentarily forgotten about the party, about the original plan to make her big revelation in public. It felt like an eternity ago, though it had only been a few hours since she had been on that stage, firm and confident. Now the idea of facing Christopher and Isabella in public, with the entire city knowing about their messy triangle, seemed far more daunting. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted, the first time she had allowed doubt to seep into her voice throughout that crazy day. "You can," Marcus said with absolute conviction, "and you will. Because, Grace, you're no longer showing up at that party as the hidden wife seeking validation. You're showing up as a CEO who just happened to have a complicated marriage. There's a huge difference. One is about you needing them. The other is about them needing to see who you've become." After she hung up, Grace sat in the silence of her bedroom, processing everything that had happened. Outside, she could hear Christopher talking on the phone in a low voice, probably with Isabella, probably trying to figure out how to fix what couldn't be fixed. She walked to the closet and found the midnight blue dress still hanging in its protective bag. She ran her fingers over the silk, feeling the promise the fabric held. In 3 days, she would wear that dress and walk into a room full of people who had judged her without ever knowing her. People who had whispered about Christopher Hartley's invisible wife without ever questioning why a woman would need to be hidden. And when she walked into that room, she would no longer be anyone's wife. She would be Grace Ashford, CEO of Vision Tech Industries, a woman who had transformed invisibility into invincibility, who had used 5 years of solitude to build an intellectual empire, who had learned that true power never comes from being seen by others, but from finally seeing herself clearly. Grace closed the closet door and returned to bed, her laptop still open, showing the notifications that kept coming in. The world was talking about her, speculating, judging, building narratives. But for the first time in 5 years, Grace didn't care what they thought. She knew who she was, and that was enough. The next 3 days passed in a dizzying blur, each hour bringing new layers of complication and public scrutiny. Grace woke up to headlines speculating about her marriage, fell asleep to constant notifications about expert analyses dissecting every word of her statement, and amidst it all, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy as the world she knew simultaneously crumbled and rebuilt itself. The Brooklyn apartment became a silent battleground. Christopher definitively moved into the guest room, and they orbited each other like planets in distant orbits, aware of each other's presence but carefully avoiding collision. He left early and returned late, presumably dealing with the chaos in his own career, as the scandal with Isabella exploded to proportions even Grace hadn't anticipated. Page 6 had not only published the compromising photos, they had constructed a full timeline. Intimate dinners while Grace was alone at home. Weekend trips to the Hamptons, where Christopher claimed to be on corporate retreats. Even photos of Isabella wearing a necklace Grace recognized as being from Christopher's favorite jewelry store, a gift he had never thought to give his lawful wife. Isabella had also released her own statement, trying to position herself as the innocent victim who didn't know Christopher was married. It was a transparent lie no one believed, especially after Christopher's former employees began leaking anonymous stories about how Isabella frequently called his office asking to speak to her husband, only to be corrected by embarrassed assistants who whispered that he was already married. Grace watched everything unfold from the sidelines, focusing her energy on what truly mattered, preparing to officially take over Vision Tech, and more immediately for the New Year's Eve party that had now become less a celebration and more a public spectacle where all eyes would be on her. Diane appeared at the apartment on the morning of the 30th, carrying makeup bags, hair tools, and a fierce determination in her eyes. Rebecca came with her, tablet in hand, preparing Grace for every possible scenario she might face that evening. Christopher confirmed his attendance, Rebecca informed as Diane began working on Grace's hair, transforming the brown strands into soft waves that cascaded elegantly over her shoulders. Isabella, too. Apparently she decided that showing up demonstrates she has nothing to hide. Grace felt her stomach clench, but kept her voice steady. And Marcus? He'll be by your side all night, as will 3 other members of the Vision Tech board. You won't be alone at any point, Grace. We'll make sure of it. The hours dragged with painful slowness as Diane worked, transforming Grace not into someone different, but into an amplified version of herself. The makeup was flawless but natural, enhancing her eyes in a way that made them seem deeper, more intense. Her hair framed her face with a romantic softness that contrasted with the strength of her determined jawline. And when it was finally time to put on the midnight blue dress, Grace barely recognized the woman in the mirror. The fabric flowed over her body like liquid water, catching light in ways that seemed impossible. The cut was perfect, elegant without being excessive, sophisticated without appearing to try too hard. Diane had chosen minimalist jewelry, just a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to Grace's grandmother, the only family who had always believed in her, and a simple white gold ring Grace had bought for herself with her first Vision Tech paycheck. "Are you ready?" Diane asked, standing behind Grace and studying her reflection in the full-length mirror. Grace didn't answer immediately. She looked at herself, truly looked, and saw not just the transformed exterior, but something deeper. She saw a woman who had survived 5 years of being invisible and emerged not broken, but forged into something stronger. She saw a CEO who was about to walk into a room full of people who had judged her without knowing her and prove them all wrong. "Yes," she finally said, her voice carrying a certainty that even surprised herself. "I'm ready." The limousine Marcus had sent waited at the curb, elegant and discreet. Grace descended the apartment stairs carefully, her high heels not yet completely natural, but growing more comfortable with each step. The driver opened the door with a respectful smile, and Grace slid inside, the dress arranging itself perfectly around her. Manhattan at night was a vision of lights and possibilities. The city pulsing with the energy of millions of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, building their futures. Grace watched the streets pass by the darkened window, remembering all the times she had looked at those same lights from afar, forbidden to truly experience them. Now she wasn't just experiencing Manhattan, she was about to conquer it. The Metropolitan Club was a fortress of stone and privilege in the heart of the Upper East Side, its windows glowing with golden light that spilled onto the street below. There was a line of limousines and luxury cars dropping off impeccably dressed passengers, all eager to enter the most exclusive New Year's Eve party of the night. Grace took a deep breath, feeling Rebecca beside her in the limousine, offering final words of encouragement. "Remember, you owe no one anything beyond your presence. You are the guest of honor tonight, Grace. Act like it." The driver opened the door, and Grace stepped out with one foot, then the other, rising in a fluid movement Diane had practiced with her dozens of times. Camera flashes exploded immediately, a constellation of white light that could have been blinding had she not prepared for it. Reporters shouted questions, curious tourists pointed, and Grace simply smiled, a serene smile that revealed nothing but absolute confidence. Marcus appeared at her side as if he had materialized from thin air, offering his arm with chivalrous elegance. "Ready to make history, CEO Ashford?" Grace accepted his arm, feeling the solidity of his support anchor her scattered nerves. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked down the red carpet together, and Grace could feel eyes on her, could hear the whispers spreading through the crowd like ripples. But unlike 5 years ago, when those whispers would have been about her inadequacy, her lack of belonging, now they were of admiration and curiosity. Who was this woman who had appeared out of nowhere? How had she remained hidden for so long? And more importantly, what did it say about Christopher Hartley that he had kept such a gem locked away? The interior of the Metropolitan Club was even more impressive than its exterior. Soaring ceilings adorned with elaborate frescoes, marble staircases that seemed to float in the air, ballrooms decorated with exotic flowers, and crystals that reflected light in thousands of dancing prisms. It was opulence in its most refined form, the kind of place where billionaires came to remind themselves of their own success. Grace swept the main ballroom with her eyes, searching for and simultaneously dreading finding Christopher. But there was no sign of him yet, nor of Isabella. Perhaps they had changed their minds, decided that facing public scrutiny was too much, or perhaps they were simply late, prolonging the inevitable. "Grace Ashford, I presume." A soft voice came from her left, and Grace turned to find a woman impeccably dressed in silver white hair, styled in an elegant chignon. "I'm Victoria Caldwell, from the Tech Forward Industries Board. I've been following your work for years, though I admit discovering your true identity was a wonderful surprise. They chatted for several minutes about technology and innovation, and Grace gradually felt herself relax into the conversation, remembering that she belonged there not by sufferance, but by merit. More people approached, executives and entrepreneurs and investors, all wanting to meet the new CEO who had captured the industry's imagination. It was during a conversation with a group of startup founders that Grace finally saw Christopher enter the ballroom. He was impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, his hair perfectly coiffed, his posture emanating the artificial confidence of someone trying to convince the world he wasn't crumbling internally. And by his side, wearing a red dress that was beautiful but predictable, exactly as Diane had predicted, was Isabella Whitmore. The ballroom didn't fall silent. That only happened in movies. But Grace felt the shift in the air, the way conversations hesitated for a fraction of a second, how eyes discreetly turned to observe the moment the love triangle would finally meet face to face. Christopher saw her almost immediately. His eyes met hers across the crowded room, and Grace saw something flicker across his face, something that could have been regret or loss or simply shock at seeing the woman he had kept hidden, now shining in the spotlight he had always denied her. Isabella followed his gaze and visibly paled, her manufactured confidence evaporating when confronted with the reality that Grace was not the pathetic creature she had likely imagined. Marcus gently touched Grace's elbow, a silent gesture of support. "You don't need to go to them," he murmured. "Let them come to you if they dare." But Grace was already moving, her legs carrying her across the ballroom with a grace she didn't know she possessed. Conversations truly stopped this time, all eyes following her path as she walked directly toward the husband who had betrayed her and the woman who had helped destroy her marriage. Grace didn't stop until she was just a few steps from Christopher and Isabella, close enough to see every detail of their expressions. The room around them seemed to hold its breath collectively, everyone waiting to see what the new CEO would do, how she would handle this highly anticipated public confrontation. But Grace did not come armed with anger or accusations. Instead, she simply stopped, looked at Christopher with a calm that came from finally having control over her own narrative, and said something no one expected. "Thank you." The two words dropped into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion that spread through the ballroom. Christopher blinked, clearly disoriented. Isabella gripped her clutch so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Thank you?" Christopher repeated, his voice laden with disbelief. "For what exactly?" Grace allowed herself a small smile, genuine in its irony. "For giving me 5 years of solitude to discover who I truly was. For hiding me so completely that I was forced to build an identity that didn't depend on your approval. For making me feel so invisible that I had no choice but to find ways to become undeniable." She saw understanding slowly dawn in his eyes, followed by something that looked suspiciously like shame. Isabella averted her gaze, unable to maintain eye contact with the woman whose marriage she had helped destroy. "You were the best teachers I could have asked for," Grace continued, her voice low but carrying through the circle of people that had formed around them, all pretending not to be listening to every word. "You taught me that external validation is a fragile foundation on which to build a life, that being loved in secret is the same as not being loved at all, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in betrayal and humiliation." Christopher took a step towards her, and for a moment Grace thought he might make a scene, might try to reclaim some authority over her that he had long lost. But Marcus subtly appeared at Grace's side, a silent reminder that she was no longer alone, would never again be alone the way she had been during those 5 interminable years. "Grace," Christopher began, his voice cracking slightly, "I never meant to." "Hurt me?" she finished. "But you did, repeatedly, systematically, for years. She paused, letting the words settle. But here's the thing, Christopher. You hurt me, but you didn't break me. You hid me, but you didn't erase me. And now, standing here in this ballroom where you so desperately wanted me not to exist, I think I finally understand that the problem was never me not being enough for your world. It was you not being big enough for mine. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the chamber orchestra in the corner seemed to have stopped playing. Grace kept her eyes fixed on Christopher. Watching the full realization of his actions finally settle on his face, she felt no triumph, no sweet revenge she had imagined, only a deep sadness for the wasted time, for the years that would never return, for the marriage that had never truly existed. Isabella finally found her voice, though it trembled when she spoke. I didn't know he was ashamed of you. He told me you were complicated. Grace turned her gaze to the other woman, studying her with clinical curiosity. Isabella was beautiful in a conventional way, with delicate features and that glow that came from never having questioned her place in the world. But her eyes were now tinged with something that looked suspiciously like guilt. You knew he was married, Grace said gently, without accusation, just stating a fact. That was enough. The specifics of our complication don't change your choice to get involved with a committed man. Isabella opened her mouth, closed it, and then simply nodded. It was the first honest thing she had done in the entire situation. The moment was broken by the arrival of Victoria Caldwell, the executive Grace had met earlier. She smoothly moved between Grace and the disconcerted couple, carrying 2 champagne flutes and offering one to Grace with a conspiratorial smile. I think you've earned this, Victoria said, her voice carrying enough authority to signal that the confrontation was over. And if you don't mind, CEO Ashford, there are at least a dozen people here who are desperate to discuss potential collaborations between Vision Tech and their own companies. Grace accepted the flute gratefully, recognizing the elegant exit Victoria had offered. She cast one last look at Christopher, seeing not the man she had loved or the man who had betrayed her, but simply a stranger with whom she had once shared a life in another existence. Enjoy the party, she said finally, and then turned, leaving them there as she allowed Victoria to guide her back into the crowd of executives and innovators who truly mattered. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of fascinating conversations and strategic connections. Grace found herself discussing artificial intelligence with the founder of a robotics company, debating data ethics with an MIT professor, and even genuinely laughing at the anecdotes of a billionaire investor who apparently collected stories about failed startups as a hobby. She was in the middle of a conversation about quantum computing when she noticed Christopher across the room, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger or resentment. It was something closer to admiration mixed with profound loss, as if he was finally seeing what he had let slip away. Isabella had disappeared at some point, probably unable to bear the weight of the judging stares and whispers that followed wherever she went. Grace felt a pang of sympathy for her. Surprisingly, Isabella had been complicit in the betrayal, yes, but she had also been a pawn in Christopher's game, used as much as Grace had been, just in a different way. As the night progressed towards midnight, Marcus led Grace to the private terrace atop the club, where a select group of CEOs and thought leaders gathered to watch the fireworks over Manhattan. The air was cold and crisp, but Grace barely noticed, absorbed by the spectacular view of the city spread out before her like an ocean of light. "How are you, really?" Marcus asked softly, far enough from the others to afford privacy. Grace considered the question carefully, not wanting to give a superficial answer to a man who had invested so much in her success. "I'm processing," she finally said. "For 5 years, I imagined this moment of confrontation. I imagined I'd feel powerful, vindicated, even cruel, but mostly I feel tired, and perhaps a little sad for the lost time. Time wasn't lost, Marcus gently corrected. It was invested in you, in building the foundation for all of this. He gestured to the city below, to the ballroom behind them filled with people who now knew her name, her worth, her story. You transform pain into purpose, Grace. That's not lost time, it's alchemy. Before Grace could respond, the loudspeakers announced the final countdown to midnight. 10, 9, 8. The crowd on the terrace joined in unison, voices mingling in anticipation. 7, 6, 5. Grace looked out over the faces around her, people who a week ago hadn't known she existed, who now saw her as an equal, as a leader, as someone worthy of respect. 4, 3, 2. Her eyes met Christopher's one last time through the glass of the inner ballroom. He was alone now, leaning against a column, watching the proceedings with the expression of a man who knew he had played the wrong game and lost everything that truly mattered. 1. The sky exploded in color, fireworks detonating in cascades of gold and silver and deep blue that reflected her dress. Manhattan roared in celebration, millions of voices shouting welcomes to the new year, to new possibilities, to the chance to start anew. Grace didn't shout. She simply stood there, champagne in hand, surrounded by allies and colleagues, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of the moment. This was her new year, but more than that, it was her new life. A life where she wasn't defined by who loved her or who hid her, but by who she had chosen to become, despite everything. Victoria appeared at her side, accompanied by 2 other CEOs Grace had met during the night. To the woman who reminded us that real power comes from within, not from external validation, Victoria toasted, raising her glass. Others joined in, a growing chorus of toasts and celebrations, to Grace Ashford, to visionary leadership, to transforming adversity into triumph. The words washed over her like a tide, and for the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she had always deserved to be here. When the fireworks finally died down and the crowd began to disperse back indoors, Marcus pulled her aside once more. "There's something you should know," he said, his expression serious. "Christopher approached some Vision Tech board members earlier today. He tried to question your ability to lead, suggesting that personal conflicts might affect professional judgment." Grace's stomach tightened. Of course Christopher would try that. It wasn't enough for him to have lost. He needed to try and drag her down with him. But Marcus was smiling, a small, satisfied smile. The board refused to even hear his concerns. Rebecca had already prepared them for potential retaliatory attacks, and frankly, after seeing your performance tonight, your literal grace under pressure, they're more confident than ever that we made the right choice. Grace felt tears prick her eyes for the first time all night, but they were tears of relief and gratitude, not pain. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me when I barely could myself." "I didn't believe in you," Marcus corrected. "I recognized you. There's a difference. Believing implies doubt. Recognizing is simply seeing what's already there." Grace woke on the morning of New Year's Day with a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight she'd carried for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The Brooklyn apartment was silent, not with the heavy quiet of abandonment that used to fill her days, but with a peaceful stillness that signaled the end of an era. Christopher had left before dawn. Grace found a brief note in the kitchen, his slanted handwriting rushing across the paper as if he'd been in a hurry to finish. "Gone to my family's place in the Hamptons. My lawyer will be in touch soon regarding proceedings. You can stay in the apartment as long as you need." Grace folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer. An artifact of a marriage that now existed only on paper. She should feel something, sadness or relief or anger, but all she found was a quiet acceptance. Some endings weren't dramatic. Some simply happened, whispering instead of exploding. Her phone was flooded with messages, Diane sending photos from the night before, Grace radiant in the midnight blue dress surrounded by industry leaders, Rebecca sharing press articles, all positive, all focused on Grace's meteoric rise instead of the marital drama. Even her mother had called, her voice trembling with emotion in the voicemail, saying how proud she was, how she'd always known Grace was destined for great things. But the message that made Grace pause came from a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Ashford, my name is Jonathan Kim, senior partner at Morrison and Associates. I represent Isabella Whitmore. She would like to meet with you if you're willing. She understands if you decline, but feels there are things that need to be said in person." Grace stared at the message for a long moment, her first instinct being to delete and block the number. She owed Isabella nothing, no conversation, no absolution, no closure. But as she stood there in the kitchen, where she had prepared countless solitary meals, Grace realized that perhaps this meeting wasn't about what she owed Isabella. It was about what she owed herself. The opportunity to close this chapter completely, without leaving unanswered questions or unprocessed hurts. She typed a reply. "Breakfast tomorrow. Bluestone Cafe in the West Village. 9 o'clock. The reply came in minutes. "She will be there. Thank you for your grace." Grace. That word kept appearing, transforming her name into a verb, a quality, a standard she hadn't consciously chosen, but which had become her trademark. Grace Ashford, who had survived 5 years of humiliation with dignity, who had confronted betrayal with elegance, who had transformed invisibility into a platform of power. The rest of the day passed in practical preparations. Grace began packing her belongings, separating what was hers from what belonged to the life she had shared with Christopher. There wasn't much that was truly hers, she realized with a pang of sadness. Most of her possessions were books and simple clothes, things that had filled the empty hours but carried no real emotional attachment. Marcus had offered to help her find a new apartment, but Grace had already made arrangements. A spacious loft in Tribeca, close to the Vision Tech offices, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. She had signed the lease 3 days prior, using the generous advance the company had provided. It would be the first truly her own space in New York, not a place where she existed on the periphery of someone else's life, but a home she had chosen for herself. The next morning, Grace arrived at the Bluestone Cafe 15 minutes early, strategically choosing a corner table that offered privacy but also a clear escape route should the conversation become unbearable. She ordered coffee, black and strong, and waited. Isabella arrived promptly at 9, visibly nervous in a way that humanized her in ways the social column photos never had. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her makeup-free face revealing dark circles and skin stained from recent crying. She wore jeans and a cashmere sweater, no jewelry apart from a simple watch, as if she had deliberately chosen to appear as unthreatening as possible. They looked at each other across the table, two sides of a triangle that had finally collapsed in on itself. Grace didn't speak, allowing Isabella to find her own words. "I don't know how to begin," Isabella finally said, her voice hoarse. "Sorry feels insultingly inadequate, but I am sorry, more than you can probably believe." Grace took a sip of coffee, considering. "Why did you want to meet me, Isabella? What do you hope to gain from this?" "Nothing," Isabella replied quickly. "I don't expect forgiveness or absolution or even understanding. I just needed to look you in the eye and acknowledge what I did. Not through press statements or lawyers, but person to person." She paused, her fingers nervously intertwining around her teacup. "I spent 5 years convincing myself you weren't real, you know. Christopher spoke so little about you that it was easy to imagine you were just an arrangement on paper, a marriage of convenience that meant nothing. I told myself I was simply filling an empty space in his life. But I was real, Grace said calmly. And the space you were filling was meant to be mine. Every event, every dinner, every moment you stood beside him in public while I was locked away at home, alone. You knew he was married, Isabella. You chose to participate in that. Isabella nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know, and there's no justification that makes it right. I was so focused on how being with Christopher made me feel important, connected, desired, that I never stopped to think about the woman who was being erased so I could exist in her place. Grace felt a wave of emotion, not anger as she expected, but something closer to shared sadness. You know he was never going to leave her for me, don't you? Not because he loved me, but because divorce would be embarrassing for his image. You were convenient, Isabella, just as I was convenient in my invisibility. I realize that now, Isabella admitted. When everything came out, when the photos were published, Christopher, he disappeared. Not to protect me or to stand by me, but to save his own reputation. I saw messages from him to his publicist, blaming me, saying I seduced him, that he was the victim, and I realized that I had been used just as much as you, only I deluded myself into thinking I had power in the situation. Grace allowed the silence to settle between them, processing. There was a strange symmetry in discovering that both had been, in their own ways, victims of Christopher's need to control his image at the expense of the women in his life. What are you going to do now? Grace asked, genuinely curious. Isabella shrugged, a raw vulnerability in her eyes. Honestly, I don't know. I'm being ousted from the social circles I used to frequent. Brands I had influencer partnerships with have cancelled contracts. My family is barely speaking to me. I'm starting from scratch and it's terrifying, but maybe it's what I deserve. Grace watched the other woman, seeing past the polished socialite to the broken person beneath. She could be cruel now, could offer judgment and condemnation that Isabella probably deserved. But looking at her, Grace saw not an enemy, but someone who had also been caught in Christopher's web of manipulation. Starting from scratch isn't punishment, Grace said finally, her voice softer than she intended. It's opportunity. I had 5 years of forced solitude that taught me who I really was when no one was looking. You have the chance to discover who you are when you're not defining yourself by other people's approval or by your relationship with a man who never truly valued you. Isabella looked at her with something akin to awe. How do you not hate me? How can you sit here and offer me anything but contempt? Grace considered the question carefully, because hate requires energy that I prefer to invest in building my new life. Because holding on to anger only traps me in the past I'm trying to leave behind. And because, she paused, surprised by the truth of her own words, in the end, we were both harmed by the same man, just in different ways. That doesn't make us friends. It doesn't erase what you did, but it makes us human, fallible, capable of bad choices and also of growth. They finished their coffee in an uncomfortable but honest truce, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. When they parted on the sidewalk, Isabella briefly touched Grace's arm. For what it's worth, I truly admire what you've built, Isabella said softly. You turned the cruelest thing that was ever done to you into fuel to become extraordinary. That's remarkable. Grace watched Isabella walk down the street, a solitary figure in a city of millions, and felt the last shred of bitterness dissolve. She wouldn't forget, would probably never fully forgive, but she was releasing the burden of carrying anger like armor. Her phone chimed with a message from Diane. First official CEO photo shoot next week. Forbes wants you for the cover. Ready to become an icon? Grace smiled, typing her reply as she walked back to the apartment she would soon be leaving. As ready as I've ever been. The following days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a new rhythm of life Grace barely recognized as her own. The divorce was processed discreetly, Christopher eager to finalize things before any more scandal could emerge. He was generous in the settlement, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps simply to buy her continued silence. But Grace accepted only what was legally hers, and nothing more. She didn't need his money. She had her own now. The loft in Tribeca became her sanctuary. Filled with modern art, she chose because it made her feel something, not because it impressed visitors. She hosted intimate dinners for colleagues who had become friends, discovering for the first time the joy of hospitality on her own terms. Diane became a close confidant, Rebecca a strategic ally in navigating her growing public presence. Vision Tech thrived under her leadership. Grace implemented policies that prioritized work-life balance, recognizing in her employees' stories echoes of her own past solitude. She launched initiatives that democratized access to technology in underserved communities, remembering her own humble origins in Portland. And on a spring afternoon, 6 months after that fateful New Year's Eve, Grace was in her office atop the Vision Tech skyscraper, looking out at Manhattan spread below her, when Marcus knocked on the door. "Got a minute?" he asked, and Grace nodded for him to enter. He held a Forbes magazine, the cover showing Grace in a tailored midnight blue suit that echoed her dress from that first night. The headline read, "Grace Ashford, from invisible to inevitable." "Oh, thought you'd like the first copy," Marcus said, handing it to her with a proud smile. Grace looked at her own image, seeing not just the polished exterior, but the journey that had led her there. The lonely nights that taught her self-reliance. The betrayal that forced her to find her own strength. The invisibility that paradoxically made her impossible to ignore. "You know what's funny?" Grace said softly. "For 5 years, I yearned to be seen, to be recognized, to matter. But now that I'm here, I realize the most important thing I learned was how to see myself. How to recognize my own worth, independent of anyone else who was looking." Marcus nodded, understanding in his wise eyes. That's the difference between being visible and being vital. Visibility can be given and taken by others, but vitality, the sense of being essential and irreplaceable that comes from within. Grace placed the magazine on her desk, beside a framed photo she had taken recently. It wasn't a polished professional image, but a casual snapshot from a Sunday in Central Park, Grace genuinely smiling at the camera, alone but complete. She looked past Marcus, through the glass windows at the city that had witnessed her at her worst and then in her triumph. New York kept moving, indifferent to the individual dramas unfolding within its limits. But Grace was no longer just another story among millions. She had become an author of her own narrative, transforming chapters of pain into a story of resilience that would resonate far beyond her own experience. "You know," Grace said, turning back to Marcus, "I used to think Christopher stole 5 years of my life, but I was wrong. He gave me 5 years to find myself, to build a foundation that couldn't be shaken by anyone else's approval or disapproval. He intended to weaken me by keeping me hidden. Instead, he made me invincible." Marcus raised an imaginary coffee cup in a toast. "To invisibility transformed into unstoppable strength." Grace smiled, feeling the truth of it resonate through her entire being. She had started as a woman, hidden, ashamed.